Hey, welcome back. You're watching The Last Climb. Now today's story is about climbers who laughed at their Sherpa's warning, mocking him for treating them like children when he asked them to turn around early. They were about to find out what happens when a line stops moving at 27,000 feet with limited oxygen and a storm closing in behind you. It was May the 19th, 2019. Mount Everest sits right on the border of Nepal and Tibet, 29,032 feet at the top, the highest point on the planet. That particular spring, the weather had only opened up a short window for summit attempts, so basically every team on the mountain was trying to squeeze through the same few days. If you have ever sat in traffic and thought about how annoying it is to lose 20 minutes, wait until you hear what a traffic jam looks like above 8,000 meters. Gregory Ashford was 52, a structural engineer from Bend, Oregon. His wife Diane was 49, a physical therapist. They had been married 22 years, and climbing was something they did together, not a hobby one of them tolerated for the other. Rainier, the easier routes on Denali, Kilimanjaro, they had done all of it as a pair over the last decade or so. Everest was supposed to be the big one, the trip before retirement, something they had been saving towards since their youngest kid left for college. Nice way to spend your 50s, I will give them that. But Everest is not impressed by a good story. They flew into Kathmandu in late March with 2 duffel bags of well-used gear. At the equipment check, Gregory's 5-year-old down suit passed inspection, though the manager noted it was older than he preferred for Everest. Gregory said it had worked on Denali and saw no reason to replace it. What he didn't account for was that Denali's cold hits hard and fast, but rarely for 16 straight hours after a climber's body is already running on empty. Everest doesn't just test what gear can handle, it tests what gear can still handle once you have nothing left. The manager also offered 2 reserve oxygen bottles, each for the crowded season. Diane declined, saying their normal supply had always been enough. Nothing about either choice violated a rule, but both went into the equipment notes. Above 26,000 feet, you are in what climbers call the death zone. The air up there only has about a third of the oxygen your body is used to at sea level. You do not adjust to that. Nobody does. Your body can hang on for a while, but it is basically running on a countdown the entire time you are up there, and the tricky part is that your judgment starts slipping before you even notice anything is wrong with you. The real danger is not always the cold. Not really. The fact that your brain quietly stops being reliable while you still feel like yourself. Their lead Sherpa guide had reached the summit 11 times over 14 years on that route. He met them in Lukla, and within a few days, had a pretty clear read on them. Gregory listened until the advice clashed with what he already believed. Diane was more direct. The guide later said she spoke to him like his safety calls were suggestions she had already outgrown. Somewhere on the trek in, Diane mentioned to him, without much prompting, that their kids were grown now and out of the house, and that this was the first trip in years that was just for the 2 of them rather than built around someone else's schedule. It was not said with any weight behind it, just a passing comment on a long walk, but it was one of the few times he heard her talk about the trip as something personal rather than something to prove. The trek from Lukla to base camp takes about 9 days and climbs nearly 10,000 feet. It is not technical, but it is the first real window guides get into how a client's body handles altitude, and it is where a lot of these impressions start forming long before anyone touches a rope. At Namche Bazaar, there is a mandatory rest day built into every itinerary on that route. Gregory did not question it much. Diane did. She asked the guide, according to him, whether he gave that same talk to every client or just the ones he figured could not keep up. Not really mean, just kind of testing him, seeing if he actually had a reason or if he was just repeating a company line. You know that tone people get when they are not really asking a question? They are just letting you know that they already have an opinion? Yeah, that. Later that same evening, Gregory mentioned to the guide, in passing, that on Kilimanjaro years earlier, Diane had developed a headache partway up that a couple of other climbers in their group treated as a reason to slow down. She pushed through it, summited fine, and it never became anything. He brought it up almost like a credential, proof that her judgment about her own body had been tested before and held up. That is the thing about one good outcome. It does not prove your judgment was right. It just means that the mountain did not push back at that time. Base camp that season held close to a dozen teams, and by the time the Ashfords arrived, Most groups had already settled into their own rhythms. A guide from a neighboring team, one who had been on the mountain 3 seasons running, mentioned afterward that he remembered Diane specifically because she had commented within earshot of his own clients that some of the older gear scattered around camp looked like it belonged in a museum. It was not aimed at anyone directly, just a passing remark, but it was the kind of thing people at base camp tend to remember once something goes wrong later. That same guide also mentioned something else, almost as an afterthought. A few days after that comment, one of his clients twisted an ankle badly enough to worry about on the rocky ground near the medical tent. And Diane was the one who walked over unasked, checked the ankle with her hands the way someone does when they actually know what they are feeling for, and told him plainly it was not broken, just wrap it and keep weight off it for 2 days. She was right. The guide said it was the kind of moment that made him second guess his read on her a little, because whatever she was like in conversation, she clearly knew her own field cold. Worth sitting with that for a second too. She was not wrong about everything. That is honestly what makes this harder to watch unfold. During the first acclimatization climb, the guide ran both of them through a simple coordination check he uses with every client. Touch your own nose with a fingertip, eyes open, then eyes closed. It sounds almost silly, but it is one of the earliest ways to catch a brain that is starting to struggle with basic signals before anything looks obviously wrong. Gregory passed both times without any trouble. Keep that in mind, because it becomes the baseline everything gets measured against later. During the first rotation through the Khumbu Icefall, which by the way is this shifting glacier full of crevasses that you cross on ladders laid sideways over the gaps, Diane picked up a dry cough somewhere around Camp 1, roughly 19,000 feet. When the guide asked about it, she cut him off before he even finished the sentence and told him she had dealt with worse on Kilimanjaro. Fine, maybe she had, but a mountain that big does not really care what you dealt with somewhere else. On the second rotation, up near Camp 2 at 21,000 feet, Gregory had a rough patch on a section that should have been easy for him. His footing was off, nothing dramatic, just sloppier than it had been earlier in the week. He blamed a bad night of sleep. Diane, watching this happen, told the guide her husband had climbed harder mountains than this one without needing a babysitter. That line stuck with the guide. He mentioned it later because it was less about defending Gregory and more about getting a jab in. A storm system held them at Camp 2 for an extra day. The radio logs from that stretch, which the operator pulled afterward, show Gregory asking about summit windows twice in one afternoon, clearly getting impatient. Diane is on those same logs telling the base camp operator, more or less, that they did not fly across the world to sit around in a tent. Fair. Waiting sucks. So does dying, and one of those two things is a lot more permanent. Their third and final rotation took them up to Camp 3, on the Lhotse face at roughly 24,000 feet, a steep stretch of blue ice that requires front-pointing crampons the whole way up. Diane's cough was still present here, though it came and went, and she mentioned to the guide it seemed to ease up whenever they dropped back down in elevation, which she took as proof it was nothing more than the thin, dry air doing what thin, dry air does. That evening in the tent, the guide overheard the two of them in a rare moment of friction between themselves, not aimed at him for once. Gregory told Diane she had been coughing all night and asked if she was actually fine or just saying so. Diane's answer was short, telling him to worry about his own footing instead of hers, referencing his stumble back at Camp 2. Later that same evening, the guide heard them again, quieter this time, Gregory asking if she wanted to just call the summit push off and go home with what they already had. Diane told him no, and that was the end of the conversation. Gregory managed the ice face competently that day. No real issues, though the guide noted he seemed to tire faster on the descent back to Camp 2 than he had earlier in the trip. After the rotations, they came back down to base camp for 4 days of rest before the summit push. The expedition doctor ran the standard daily oxygen saturation checks during this stretch, a small clip on the fingertip that reads how well the blood is carrying oxygen. Diane's reading came back a few points lower than the doctor would have expected, given her fitness level. She suggested it was probably just a bad reading, maybe the device slipping on her finger, and asked to move on to the next thing on the schedule. The doctor noted the reading but did not have grounds to hold her back over one number that could plausibly have been a faulty reading. During this stretch, the lead guide also did a full equipment and oxygen briefing, going through exactly how many bottles each client would carry, expected flow rates at each stage, 2 liters a minute up through the balcony, bumping to 3 or 4 higher up if needed, and what the backup plan looked like if someone burned through their supply faster than expected. Standard stuff, the same talk he gave every client every season. The night before the summit push, at Camp 4, the guide called a final briefing, same as he did with every client before a summit attempt, except this time he added something extra. He had been watching how packed the route was getting all week and told them he wanted to move the turnaround time up from the usual 2 in the afternoon to 1 and leave Camp 4 a little earlier than planned, just to get ahead of the bigger groups before the real bottlenecks formed. Diane laughed first and asked if he was also going to start cutting up their food next, since apparently they could not be trusted to make a single decision on their own anymore. Gregory couldn't help laughing and added that they had summited plenty of mountains without needing a curfew. The guide tried once more, explaining that a 1 o'clock start would give them more time if the weather changed. Diane said every other climber on that route that season had started at 2 and done just fine, so they would too. He let it go, knowing another argument would probably only make them dig their heels in. 2 o'clock stayed the plan. Funny thing is, that was the moment everything got laid out pretty clearly. 2 people about to walk into conditions your body cannot survive in for long, and the response to an extra hour of safety margin was a joke about helmets. They left Camp 4 at 10:30 that night, the guide directly ahead of them. Same position he had held every single rotation leading up to this. Temperatures were sitting somewhere around negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit, not unusual for a summit push, and the wind was manageable at that point, nothing that gave anyone reason for concern. Near a spot called the balcony, around 27,700 feet, they ran into their first real jam. A guide from a larger commercial team behind them later estimated close to 30 climbers backed up along that stretch of rope alone, most of them from 2 larger groups that had left Camp 4 around the same window. That same guide recalled noticing Diane's coughing specifically, saying it stood out even among a crowd of people breathing hard in the cold. The lead guide figured later they lost close to 2 hours just standing there, doing nothing productive, just burning bottled oxygen while their bodies sat exposed at an altitude that does not really do anyone favors for just standing around in. Diane's cough had changed by then, gone from dry to something wetter, something that took real effort to clear out. The guide checked her oxygen flow at this point, bumped it slightly, and asked how she was doing. She brushed him off again, same as every other time, though this time it took her a little longer to get the sentence out. Kinda wild, right? You would think somewhere around 28,000 feet the sarcasm would just run out of oxygen, along with everything else. Apparently not. Reaching the south summit at roughly 28,700 feet, they pushed on through the Cornice Traverse and hit a second backup near the base of the Hillary Step, worse than the first. Gregory started missing his carabiner clips here, twice, on the first attempt. Something he had not done anywhere earlier on the trip. The guide ran the same nose touch check on him right there on the ridge. Gregory managed it, but slower than he had during acclimatization, and missed on the first try with his eyes closed. Diane, still ahead of her own decline without really knowing it yet, told the guide her husband should have trained harder before this trip. Even that far up, even that deep into the hardest hours of the climb, her first instinct was still to needle him rather than worry about either of them. Another independent climbing pair in that same line, according to their own guide's later account, made the call to turn back entirely at this point, citing the hour and the look of the sky to the west, which by then had shifted to a flatter, grayer color that anyone who has spent time up there learns to take seriously. The Ashfords did not. By this point, it was well past 2 o'clock. The lead guide made his final call right there and told them they needed to turn around. Gregory said they were close enough that turning back now did not make sense. Diane, when the guide asked her directly, told him this was exactly the kind of caution she had been talking about the night before, and that they would decide for themselves when they were finished, not before he decided for them. The guide continued up with them anyway. Leaving 2 clients alone that high on the mountain was never something he was willing to do, whatever they thought of his warnings. It was also the point where his own plan stopped being his own. Every guide on that route paces their own oxygen and effort around a personal cutoff, same as they ask of their clients. And his had been 2 o'clock as well. Past that point, every additional hour above the death zone was time he had not budgeted for either. I do not know, is that loyalty or is that even doing your job, even when the people you are doing it for will not listen to a word you say? Maybe both. Either way, it cost him something too. Not just them. They reached the summit just before 3 in the afternoon, confirmed later by time-stamped photos pulled off both their cameras. By then, they had already been climbing for more than 16 hours straight since leaving Camp 4, an hour past even the earlier turnaround time the guide had pushed for and never got. The guide himself noted afterward that his hands had started feeling clumsier on the fixed ropes by the time they reached the top, small fumbling with clips he normally managed without thinking, a sign he recognized from past summits as his own body starting to run low on reserves. The descent started right away. Within the first half hour, the wind picked up noticeably, and visibility along the ridge started closing in patches. Thick, 1 minute, clear enough to see the next fixed anchor the next. Between the summit and the south summit, Diane stopped several times to lean against the fixed rope, coughing in a way the guide said sounded different from anything he had heard out of her the whole trip. Longer fits, and it took her longer each time to catch her breath afterward. Somewhere in this stretch, footage recovered later from Gregory's own camera, filmed without any narration, just a habit of his to record bits of the descent, showed several seconds of him struggling with the zipper pull on his suit collar, fumbling at it with a gloved hand for what the footage timer showed as nearly 30 seconds before giving up and leaving it partly open. He never says anything on the recording. He just stops trying and keeps walking. Right around the Hillary step on the way down, Gregory stopped responding correctly when the guide asked him a basic question about how much oxygen he had left. He gave an answer that did not match the gauge. The guide checked himself a moment later. Small thing on its own, but paired with the missed carabiner clips earlier, it was the second clear sign that his thinking was not tracking the way it should. By this stretch, the guide was also stopping more than he normally would, twice needing an extra few breaths before continuing on sections he would usually move through without pausing. He said afterward he recognized what that meant, even as it was happening, that he was no longer operating with the margin he had planned for himself back at Camp 4, and that continuing to manage 2 failing clients while his own reserves thinned was not something he had faced in quite that combination before. At around 28,300 feet past the south summit, Diane sat down on the ridge and told the guide she just needed a minute. The guide radioed Camp 4 right then, letting base camp know 2 clients were struggling at that elevation and that a weather system looked to be closing in faster than expected. The radio operator on duty at Camp 4 logged the call at 4:11 that afternoon, and it was that same operator who kept the channel open for the rest of the day, relaying updates between the guide and the rest of the team below. That call gave base camp time to start working the problem, though there was never really a version of this where anyone could climb up into that terrain fast enough to matter. A helicopter was mentioned early on. Someone at base camp raised it as an option, but rescue aircraft at that altitude only operate in a narrow band of calm weather, even under ideal circumstances, and with the wind already climbing and visibility falling, it was never cleared for takeoff at all that day. A short distance up from Diane, Gregory was struggling too, missing footholds he had handled fine just hours earlier, and when the guide asked him simple questions, his answers came slower than they should have, like he needed extra time just to process what he was being asked. He made his way down to where Diane and the guide had stopped. By the time he got there, neither one of them could really keep moving under their own power anymore. The storm hit full force sometime after 4 that afternoon. The wind was strong enough that standing upright without holding the rope became difficult, and the temperature dropped so fast that exposed skin was at risk within minutes. The guide stayed close, checked Diane's oxygen bottle and found it nearly empty, then switched Gregory onto their last emergency reserve bottle while saving his own remaining supply for the descent. At some point, he also noticed Gregory's older suit was not holding heat as well as the newer gear other climbers were using that season, though there was no way to know how much difference it made by then. According to him, Diane stopped responding to her name at some point during that stretch. He could not tell you the exact minute. There was no real way to check a watch in that kind of weather, but he said he checked for her breath a few times, found it faint, and then at some point later, did not find it at all. Gregory held on a bit longer. The guide said his eyes stayed open but stopped really focusing on anything, and he stopped responding when the guide tried to get him to move his hands or answer something simple. His breathing turned irregular after that, longer gaps between breaths each time, until eventually it just did not start back up. I keep thinking about what that must have done to him. He had spent hours trying to keep them moving, and then there was nothing left to ask of either of them. By the time it was over, the guide himself was in rough shape, well past the point he would normally allow for his own safety margin, and still had a full descent through worsening conditions ahead of him, alone. He stayed with them until the wind made staying any longer a decision that would have cost him his own life too. He clipped back onto the rope and started down, in conditions he described afterward as the worst he had ever climbed in during his entire career on that mountain. and with less in reserve, physically, than he had ever had left at that stage of a descent before. The radio operator at Camp 4 kept the channel open through the rest of the afternoon and into the evening, logging the guide's last confirmed check-in before the descent, and the long gap afterward before he was heard from again. Base Camp knew well before the storm peaked that a rescue climb up into that terrain was not something anyone could safely attempt, not with those winds, not with visibility gone. So the response, such as it was, came down to keeping the channel open and waiting to see who came down on their own. The guide reached camp 4 hours later, after dark, with frostbite on 2 fingers and gaps in his memory of parts of that descent. A search team went back up 2 days later once the weather finally cleared enough to move. The team leader radioed down around mid-morning, confirming both climbers had been located together on the ridge, still clipped to the same rope anchor the guide had described, positioned close enough to each other that the team leader noted it in his report. Close, like neither one had tried to move away from the other in whatever time they had left. Her camera was recovered nearby, along with a GPS unit that had kept logging position data the entire time, showing no further movement past the point the guide described. Gregory's oxygen bottle was found empty beside him. His down suit, examined afterward by the operator's equipment team, showed signs of reduced loft and the insulation consistent with its age, though the operator's report stopped short of calling it a direct factor, noting only that it likely offered less protection than newer gear would have during those final hours. The operator's report reconstructing the timeline was pieced together from the guide's own account of those final hours, the radio operator's logs from Camp 4, secondhand accounts from the other guides who had shared the same queue that day, along with GPS data that mapped out the timing of the climb and exactly when the storm rolled in. Time-stamped photos and footage recovered from both their cameras filled in the rest of the summit push, including the brief clip of Gregory struggling with his suit zipper during the descent. The report also noted that both climbers had used slightly more oxygen than projected, largely from the 2 hours lost in the queue near the balcony, and that the reserve bottles declined at the gear check in Kathmandu would likely have covered that shortfall. Separately, the coroner's findings addressed cause of death directly. Diane's cause of death was recorded as fluid buildup in the lungs, consistent with prolonged time spent at extreme altitude. Gregory's cause of death was recorded as swelling in the brain, also tied to prolonged oxygen deprivation above 26,000 feet, and consistent with the coordination and cognitive changes the guide had noted starting near the Cornice Traverse. Both reports pointed to the hours lost in the queues. The summit reached well past the recommended turnaround, and the storm arriving faster than expected as the main contributing factors. The operator's closing statement noted that the guide had stayed with both climbers through the worst of the storm, at real cost to his own physical condition by the end of it, and that his choice to remain on that ledge instead of descending earlier had put his own life at risk, a risk nobody asked him to take. Experience is useful, but it can also make you trust the wrong things. You can do difficult things for years and still miss the moment when the situation around you has changed. That is true on a mountain, but honestly, it is true almost everywhere.